I used to be on the BBC in Scotland all the time. I mean, I would be on several times a month on BBC Scotland, on BBC Network. I used to write in the Guardian. If you can still consult my articles in the Guardian, but there's no way that I would be published by the Guardian now, and no way the BBC would have me on. It was simply impossible. And so we voices like mine have been just crowded out of the mainstream.
We're the lucky inhabitants of an era where truth isn't merely distorted, but where it's being engineered. Where news isn't reported, but where it's being manufactured. Where the mainstream press no longer serves as a watchdog over power, but as an instrument of it. If you are a regular viewer of my channel, none of this is a surprise for you. But if you're not, have a quick look at my archive. I promise you, it's worth your time. Today, once again, we are not here to just nibble at the edges of this reality. We are here to look beyond the headlines and to expose how states, militaries, and media corporations in concert manufacture illusions, seduce publics, and wage psychological warfare on you, all under the banner of journalism. My guest today, Professor David Miller, has not just studied this machinery, seriously studied, academically studied. He has stood against it, and for that, he has paid the price, as you can see on these headlines. British academic David Miller defined under Terrorism Act after reporting from Lebanon. And from the BBC, Bristol University academic unfairly dismissed for anti-Zionist views. That's quite a turnaround from the BBC, because initially they were not that supportive. But viewer discretion advised, because in the following interview we are discussing some seriously controversial topics. That's why wherever possible I have provided the sources with links and all in the description below. So before you crucify us, do your own research. And here we go. Professor David Miller, glad to have you back. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Nice to be here again.
Yes, we spoke, I think a year ago or so. Was it really that? In the meantime, I had, of course, the chance to read your book, and we're gonna come back to that in a moment. Yeah, but we just discussed prior to the call. I'm looking at your Substack, and I recommend readers or listeners or viewers to have a look at your Substack. Now I need to look. It's actually David Miller Tracking Power. Or do you have also one at Spinwatch? Are those two different ones?
No, there's just one Substack, which
Okay.
is tracking power update.
Okay, so I'm looking here, and there is a post from you, and it says, the meeting the Palestine Solidarity Campaign tried to ban. Please elaborate.
Well, so um, there's been a long running issue with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK, which is the main organisation which, with a coalition of others, organises the mass demos, which is that it's um, worried about anti-Zionism and tries to do its best to, as I would see it, sabotage the emerging anti-Zionist movement, which of course is becoming stronger as a result of the genocide. So while the PSC itself used to have anti-Zionism in its constitution, it removed it recently, but in most its most recent statements, it's claimed to be an anti-Zionist organization, but nevertheless, it refuses to allow leading anti-Zionists to speak on its platforms. So, for example, Low Key, the well-known rapper, is banned from Palestine Solidarity Campaign platforms, even though he used to be their patron. Members of Palestine Action, the direct action group, cutting edge of the anti-Zionist movement, they are banned from Palestine Solidarity Campaign platforms, as are other people on the left like Chris Williamson or George Galloway or Yvonne Ridley, or indeed, of course, Leila Khaled, the famous Palestinian freedom fighter from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, also banned by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So there's a kind of difficulty with their politics, which is that they don't want to, I suppose if you put it from their point of view, don't want to appear to be too extreme. And of course, they suspended a whole branch in Manchester, one of the biggest branches in the country, after the Manchester branch had a protest which called for support for the resistance in Palestine, which was too far for as far as the Palestine Solidarity Campaign was concerned. And so it's a kind of timidity, and therefore they've started to do is to try to police the anti-Zionist movement. So they actually compile dossiers and information on people who they think are not appropriate, and they send them round to their branches. So in my case, there's been a history of this. They tried to have me stopped from speaking at a branch, the Hastings branch, about 2 years ago. The branch ignored them. They've tried to have me stopped speaking at a number of other places. And what happened last Friday was that the Chelmsford Palestine Solidarity Campaign invited me to speak. As soon as this was made public, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign head office in London contacted them and said that Miller was a dodgy character. Here are four things he said. Obviously, he can't be platformed by PSC, and you'll have to cancel the meeting or remove him from the platform. And what then happened was that the Chelmsford Palestine Solidarity Campaign, to their immense credit, the next day resigned from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and created a new campaign called Chelmsford Action for Palestine, and put the meeting kept the meeting on the same dates as it had always been, and it eventually went off last Friday night in Chelmsford. Very successful, good meeting, big meeting with, amongst others, Chaim Rishith, the well-known anti-Zionist academic, and a number of other high-profile speakers.
A lot of politics. I mean, it's really astounding, and that what surprised me when I dove in this years ago. There is such a fragmentation, yeah, even within the Palestine community itself and all the organizations around them. Yeah, which brings me to my second question before we start. So last time we spoke, it was just a couple of weeks, I believe, after the court case that you actually won against the Bristol University, and if I remember correctly, one of the main, how shall I say this, outcomes was that the judge actually confirmed, no, you cannot equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Now, I believe they went into appeal, right? So where are you here when it comes to this court case at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, even the Guardian newspaper referred to this as a landmark judgment. So the University of Bristol had said that I had been sacked for being unprofessional. And the court determined that that was wrong, and that the reason I had been sacked was because I had anti-Zionist views, which the university thought were so outrageous that I had to be sacked. And the court confirmed not only that they weren't outrageous, but they were worthy of respect in a democratic society, which is the technical language used for determining what are protected beliefs under the Equality Act 2010. So anti-Zionist views are now protected beliefs according to this judgment, and you cannot be discriminated against in any workplace in the UK on the basis of having anti-Zionist beliefs. So that's, as the Guardian put it, a landmark judgment. Now, of course, the university, whatever is the mechanism by which they've come to this decision, have decided to appeal the judgment. I imagine that their lawyers will have advised them to do this, and I imagine that various Zionist interest groups will have been pressuring them to do this in one way or another. And so what will happen is that there will be an employment appeal tribunal. The original tribunal is in Bristol, where I live. The appeal will be in London, and it will be on the basis of the University of Bristol's attempt to suggest that the original tribunal have misunderstood the law, and therefore that they shouldn't have come to the judgment that they did, which was that I was wrongfully dismissed, and that I was dismissed because of my anti-Zionist views. So that will happen on the 11th, 12th, and 13th of November this year, and we will see what
Last year.
happens. No, no, the appeal will be this year
Ah,
in November.
and if okay, okay, sorry, yeah,
So it's coming up. So it's what, 6 months away now,
yeah.
approximately, and so then we'll see what happens. I mean, the case that they have on the law seems, from the accounts I've been able to glean, to be weak, but it seems to have been weakened in recent weeks because there was a case at the appeal court, which is a level above the Employment Appeal Tribunal. And that case was in relation to a Christian teacher in the west of England who, on her own Facebook page, posted views which are critical of her school's teaching on gender ideology and on the place of homosexuality in family relationships. And she was sacked, and then the tribunal that she went to found that she was rightly sacked because her views were deemed to be outside the acceptable views, or at least the way in which she had expressed them was outside the realm of acceptable views. And so she went to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, and the tribunal said that the original tribunal should reconsider because they had got the law wrong on the question of the relationship between underlying views, Christian views in her case, anti-Zionist views in my case, and the manner of expression of those views, which of course was the same issue which the university were complaining about in relation to me. They were saying it's perfectly possible for him to be an anti-Zionist, but the way in which he expressed his anti-Zionist views was not acceptable. So the teacher in this case, didn't think that that was a strong enough rebuke to the original employment tribunal. So she went to the appeal court. I mean, quite a legally brave thing to do, if you ask me, because of course it costs money, and she might not necessarily have won. But the judgment came back about a month ago now. It's the Higgs case, in case you want to look it up, against Higgs versus Farmers School, Farmor. And the appeal judgment came back that she was completely right, that the original tribunal was completely wrong, that she shouldn't have been sacked for those views, that the views were her own protected views, and that the manner of expression of the views was in no way problematic. It was simply there was simply as the legal speak has it, a close and direct nexus between her underlying beliefs and her manner of expression. Now that case is of course very, very relevant to my case, in the sense that that's exactly the same issue which the university was challenging me on, which was the manner of expression of my anti-Zionist views. And there's an additional relevance, which is that the university's solicitor or law, or sorry, or counsel in my case in the tribunal was also counsel for the school in that case. So he has, if you like, lost twice, and we hope that this case shows that he is likely to lose a third time.
Okay, I cross my fingers for you. Okay, good. Now, I reached out because I saw another article on Substack, which is how Israel used seductive imagery to hide its military transgressions. That's one. But I would also kind of, if we can, talk about another article of yours, the propaganda we pass off as news around the world. I mean, it's kind of overlapping anyway. Yeah. So the how Israel uses seductive imagery. I mean, we all have seen on, as at least for those whose Twitter account has not been permanently suspended, such as mine, they can still see, those imagery of how shall I say this, of sensual, beautiful Israeli women kind of being the, how shall I call this, the honey trap for recruitment and other purposes. So maybe you can explain.
Yeah, so this is an article I did some time ago and shared on my Substack. I wrote it with a couple of people from TRT World, which is, of course, is a Turkish broadcaster. I've done a few pieces with them recently. Essentially, we looked at this kind of weird thing that the Israeli related social media accounts and the accounts of individual members of the occupation forces were being used to show female members of the occupation forces as being attractive, as being what is the word they use? They use the word Zionist, don't they, to indicate that these are really brave women who will take on these subhuman Palestinians and reactionary Muslims, and will be sort of a light unto nations, which of course is their view of themselves. So that's a kind of PR tactic and technique which they've been using quite extensively. And there's a famous image which I think is in the piece where as a young woman looking up at the camera. She's a Russian settler, of course, saying that when people are mean to the IDF, they're being mean to me. and trying to personalize it. So, you couldn't possibly be mean to a beautiful young woman is the kind of view that you're given. And there's something which we don't say in the article, which I think has come to my attention since then, really, is the way in which uh, sex and sexuality and consent are at the core of the Zionist project. So that it's not just that we know that the Zionists have to lie consistently because, of course, their case is intrinsically poor, but it's also that they have to kind of gaslight the whole world by saying the opposite of what's the truth. And indeed, in the now famous phrase, every Zionist accusation is a confession. So you have, on the one hand, this kind of portrayal of the IDF as being a noble army, as being full of beautiful, brave women, and all of that stuff. At the same time, as the IDF is what is known to be involved in systematic rape and abuse, sexual abuse of prisoners, men, women, and children, as the data shows. And so the image that they give is precisely the inverse of the actual reality. And so the idea that we shouldn't be cruel to beautiful looking young women in the occupation forces at the same time as there is mass rape, including sexual abuse by female occupation forces officers, not just by male officers, is extraordinary. And I think that's one of the weird things really about Israeli society is that they have this kind of obsession with sex, rape, even with child sexual abuse. I mean, that's one of the key things that you notice when you start to look at this. I've just done a program on this for Palestine Declassified, which is the show I'm a producer and a resident expert on. And it's maybe worth explaining a little bit about this. I mean, there was a case some years ago in Cyprus where 5 or 6 young Israeli tourists were accused of raping a young British woman. And eventually, what happened? The process, what that happened was that the uh, the woman's allegations were withdrawn by her under duress from the Cypriot police. And the young men, the attackers, then left, went back to Ben Gurion Airport, where they were greeted by their families with shouts of Israeli pride, champagne was opened, etc. And of course, what happened later was that the woman's testimony was true, and she came back to court, and it was shown that this was that her, she and in fact what happened was she was actually convicted of a crime for lying about rape, and then she overturned that conviction, etc., etc. So we know that those Israeli tourists were involved in such an offence. And of course, there was another case in Cyprus some years later. The first one was in 2019. The second one was 2023, which is only just concluded, in which the attackers in that case again got off, but that case is now being appealed by the most senior legal officials in Cyprus. So that's 2 examples out of many, many, many examples that could be given of the way in which Israelis act overseas when they're tourists, which is that their involvement in rape and sexual abuse is really quite notable and exceptional. It's not that rape is unheard of in other societies, but it's a kind of exceptional way in which it occurs. And you see that if you look at the NGOs inside occupied Palestine who study this stuff. And there's a famous case recently of 30 young men who raped a young woman in Eilat, and in fact queued up waiting to rape her. A really very famous case. And if you look at the data on prevalence in general, you see that there have been, since 2018 or 19, there's been a rash of I mean, I hesitate to describe this because it seems so outlandish, but a rash of gang rapes of young women at school. So young women between 11 and 16. Uh, and this is reported in the Israeli press, doesn't get much play outside the occupied territory, but that there's a real issue of not understanding what sexual consent is in Israel. 60% of more than 60% of Israeli men don't regard rape of an acquaintance as either rape or wrong. And indeed, 40% of Israeli women apparently believe the same thing. So there's a real depth of malaise within Israeli society, which I think these kind of tales tell you something about, and it's worth in thinking about that to contrast that with the use of the propaganda of the young pretty women as being a kind of selling point for the Israeli experiment.
I think we would need to include some source data for the statements that you just made. Otherwise, they crucify both of us. So I'm gonna come back to you on that one. Yeah.
Sure.
But my question would be coming back to the kind of sexualization of the army. Yeah? Does
Yeah.
it work, and why does it work?
Well, I think it works with those people who are convinced Zionists and those people who are on the fringes of being convinced Zionists. But we know that in general, Israeli messages, Zionist messages in the last year and a half have not worked and have driven millions and millions of people away from Zionism, including significant numbers of Jews, especially in the US, uh, to some extent in the UK as well, I think. So that's the difficulty they face with Hasbara, with this kind of Hasbara, and with all their Hasbara, which is their word for propaganda, is that people can see the dead bodies, the children, the bombing of tents, the execution of rescue workers, the systematic targeting of journalists, the sniping of children, the deliberate sniping of children, and the shooting of children in the head, 3 and 4 years old, 5, 6 years old. That people can see that, and that nobody thinks that's good. Not even their supporters think that's good. I mean, some of their supporters glory in it, but the ones who are the more liberal end of the spectrum outside occupied Palestine, they realize this is bad for the Zionist movement, and they try and ignore it or cover it up or pretend it's not as bad as it was or that kind of thing. So it's the difficulty they have is that they are losing the public relations battle. If there were to be a global vote on this, there would be no more Israel. But we don't live in a society where any kind of global voting would have any kind of effect. And of course, we have the fact that the remaining supporters of Israel, which make a difference, of course, are those at the state level in the West, the US most obviously, but also the UK, which provides intelligence support to the IDF, and of course the Germans who supply something like 29% of weaponry, whereas the Americans supply something like 70%.
You call this a softening weapon, meaning softening up the receptivity of the observer. That's what you mean, right?
Yes, I mean, but it doesn't work. I mean, that's their difficulty. I mean, their difficulty is that long term, nobody likes Zionists anymore, and people are much less reluctant to say that they don't like Zionists now than they were 18 months ago. I mean, people. I've said stuff about Zionism for quite a while now, for several years now, and while people quite often are friendly and they talk to me, you can see that they sort of think that the things I'm saying are a little bit out there. And in the last 18 months, what's happened is that the scales have fallen from people's eyes. They suddenly started to realize. Let me give you one recent example is the case of Ben Gavir's visit to New York. And the other day he was at the headquarters of a Hasidic sect called Chabad Lubavitch in Brooklyn, in Atlantic Parkway in Brooklyn. And there was a riot outside, you've
I
probably have
saw
seen
it.
the
I saw
image
it.
of the young woman who was beaten up and had a neck brace on, who apparently is Jewish, but by the way, that's what fascism in Israel looks like, and it's now come to New York, and people they sort of penny drops because for a long time I've been saying about Chabad that this is an ultra genocidal cult, ultra-genocidal Zionist cult. Uh, and and there we are. They have a riot outside and they beat up people who come to protest against a fascist Israeli politician. And so all the stuff I've been saying about Chabad, I've been doing research on this, I've been writing about it. Suddenly people think, oh, maybe David's not quite as mad as we thought. Maybe what he's saying has some merit. Maybe he's actually done some research on this, which of course is the basis of everything I do is my research. So that's the way in which this is going. Is that people are being picked off one by one. I see some local activists around here are referring to themselves as doing ant work, which is that each of their protests hopefully moves a grain of sand, and eventually the grain of sands cohere and collapse the Zionist project.
Yeah. Again, doing a little bit of research for this interview, I saw like incredible smear campaign against you from everywhere, from Wikipedia to articles to I don't know what all. It's just amazing. But of course, you're not the only one. I mean, I could
Yeah,
name many other examples. Yeah. But the point
sure.
what you just said is you are a scientist. You actually do scientific research, and this is so easy to be kept under the rug. But what makes you especially interesting for me is that you did or do still research in regards to propaganda, manipulation, and these kind of things. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in talking to you.
Mm.
And this is not only restricted, of course not. It's not only restricted to Israel. I mean, U.S. What do I have here? US military recruitment using TikTok influencers. Ukraine portraying female fighters in heavily stylized woke, spreads. India, Bollywood, and nationalism over Kashmir. I mean, this is not only restricted to Israel. We see this. I mean, this. How shall I say this? Mm, the concept that Israel practices is anyway spreading. Uh, we had the first Indian prime minister visiting Israel ever. These kind of things, right? That means also the propaganda, and especially because Israel is coming back to Israel, because it's losing the image war. Because those images that come out from their own soldiers depicting war crimes, they go in people's subconscious, causing cognitive dissonance. Yeah.
Mm.
So when we talk about propaganda, because in a very basic sense, that's basically it. Where do you see the greatest challenges at this time? I mean, we're talking about. I mean, in Netherlands, we're talking about war, getting into a war economy, diversion Russia, but it's everywhere. So propaganda is in overdrive everywhere. So that's the greatest challenge.
Well, I mean, that's a that's a big question. But obviously the way in which propaganda has developed in the last 140 years or so, from the 1914-18 war onwards, and even before that, has it's been led by those states that have been mostly involved in prosecuting such wars. And those were the Western states, the US, the UK, Germany, and that those techniques have spread around the world. So of course the Indians use them in Kashmir, and they're used by the military of many countries. I mean, NATO has a center, doesn't it, for propaganda in where is it, in Latvia or Lithuania, one of the two, and they generalize their experience there. They have people from Britain, and they have the Baltic states, and they have all sorts of other people learning propaganda, and of course that played into the attempt by the Ukrainians to uh, develop propaganda after the special military operation was launched a couple of years ago. And of course, I've written about that as well, and about the way in which the techniques were used, propaganda techniques were used in Ukraine. But I think that we are facing a period where the kind of understandings that we had about propaganda and about the role of the state, even if we were uh, critics of Western power have changed. I mean, it used to be the case in the West amongst Western leftists that there would be a critique of capitalism or of neoliberalism latterly, and indeed of imperialism, but there was a sense in which, for most of the period between 1945 and even up to the 1990s, that although there were conservative forces at play, that progress would find a way. There had been progress on class inequality, there had been progress on gender equality, progress against racism, progress against homophobia, and all of those things were thought to be effectively, uh, if not irreversible, to eventually to be victorious. And now we don't really have that anymore, and especially what we don't have in the last year and a half is any real adherence by Western ideologues to this notion that they adhere to what they call the rules-based order or international law or humanitarian law or against war crimes. I mean, that settlement at the end of the Second World War and the Nuremberg trials, which is supposed to have animated everything that the Western powers did since then, we now see trashed on the floor. And we see Ben Gvir going to the States and uh, inviting President Trump to contradict him when he says, of course, there'll be no more food going into Gaza. Now, it's just unimaginable that 5 years ago that could have happened. That he stands there advertising the most grievous war crimes, and nobody contradicts him. And indeed, the president of the United States doesn't contradict him. And so we face the end of any kind of semblance of the liberal order, and that of course moves us much closer to a kind of authoritarianism, which is kind of akin to fascism. I mean, we shouldn't get hung up, I don't think, on the term, but the the idea of the kind of noble values of the West has been killed by Israel in the last year and a half, and I think that's the most interesting thing about it in relation to propaganda, because of course propaganda techniques themselves, can be generalized and can be used by other people, but the overarching propaganda narrative of the West has collapsed, and I think that's the instructive thing.
And the rest of the world, the so-called global south, is very aware of that. We are in this little Western bubble of six, also NATO countries, let's say we, the West, are 16% of the world population. And we're living in this glorified media bubble. But because you briefly mentioned NATO, I don't know, are you aware of NATO's recent 2022 cognitive warfare program?
No.
No. Okay. So now and then I dropped this. It's also new for me. I started to do some research. They have a cognitive warfare program, and that means they're targeting each individual,
Yeah.
not only the enemy population, but also their own population to create an atmosphere for war. So I will come back to this in future. In future, I will send you I will send you the title of a book that I'm reading about this. So
Yeah.
again, Western forces losing the image war and reverting because of it to more and more drastic means to kind of keep their own populations in mind, in line. This is what this cognitive warfare program of NATO is actually about.
Well, I mean,
Um,
that's,
Now
I
there
mean,
was a second article which, sorry,
you mentioned that. I mean, I haven't come across that thing particularly. It sounds fascinating, but of course there is a large effort in the whole NGO world to engage in this kind of area. So that narrative management, the disinformation industry, all of that, which of course has inputs from NATO states and from the military, but also from international philanthropists. George Soros, of course, is one of them, but there are others who are investing in this stuff, and the anti disinformation work. I mean, there's a key organization in the UK called the CCDH, the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which also has an office in the US, which is involved in this kind of activity, which is about trying to manage global discourses in favor of their paymasters. Now, in the case of the CCDH, their paymasters are both the military industrial complex and, of course, the Zionist entity itself. So that is a huge thing. That notion of narrative dominance and cognitive manipulation, although they don't call it manipulation. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fascinating.
Okay. So, whilst in the past, the mainstream press, which is, I mean, the moment you say the word mainstream press, at least in my circles, it's right away there's a connotation in there. Yeah, less and less people trust the mainstream press.
Yeah.
They're no longer a watchdog as they were supposed to be. They're more an enabler and a megaphone of the, let's say, the state narrative. So how do you see that?
Well, I mean, again, this is part of the same tendency, which is that that there was a period after the Second World War where there were meaningful ways in which the organized working class or left wing movements could make a difference to the society. Those ways have gone. Those avenues have been closed off. And of course, the mainstream media has increasingly constricted itself. I mean, I just could tell you this in relation to my own experience. I used to be on the BBC in Scotland all the time. I mean, I would be on several times a month on BBC Scotland, on BBC Network. I used to write in the Guardian. If you can still consult my articles in the Guardian, if you go and look them up on Comment is Free. There's no way that I would be published by the Guardian now, and no way the BBC would have me on. It was simply impossible. And so we voices like mine have been just crowded out of the mainstream, and this is my story is not unique. It's emblematic of a whole range of constriction of views across the mainstream, and the way in which great power has seen to it in one way or another, through market forces, but also through direct intervention, that radical views are seen as increasingly radical and as not worthy of respect in a democratic society, to use that phrase again, and pushed out. So it's a long term historical process.
I'm wondering, and I don't think there are really specific numbers, yeah. But again, we said already that the mainstream media is losing credibility. But but percentage-wise, in terms of population, I mean, if you talk to the normal people on the street, so to speak, then I have the feeling they're eating the propaganda that's coming in uncritically. But at the same time, we are saying mainstream media is losing credibility. So, what's the percentage here? Do we know at all?
No, no, we don't. But I mean, you've also got something else going on in the alternative, the blogosphere, the social media, which is that there's a strong right wing, sometimes ultra right wing presence there. So while the mainstream media may be amplifying dominant voices, you've also got a war for social media, and of course that war is fought by powerful influences. The Zionists are amongst those. When Benjamin Netanyahu went to the US the other day, he met with a selection of podcasters and influencers, and what he's trying to do there is to try and shore up support for Israel in on the right. So of course, there's traditionally on the right, people would support Israel and Zionism, but now on the right there are those on the far right, including on the far right, are those who are very critical of Israel. So sometimes they're called white nationalists. But I mean, even people like Candace Owens, or further to the right, Nick Fuentes, these are people who are much more critical of Israel than the right ever would be before. So there's an attempt to shore that up by Netanyahu. So they're actually focusing on the podcasters, the blogosphere, social media as being an arena for propaganda warfare.
Yeah, and that's not unique for Israel. I saw two American bloggers actually interviewing Lavrov from Russia. Yeah, so they're trying to kind of get access to this new generation that consumes news differently than the previous one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Now, when we come to mainstream media, I mean, the one example that I have in my head is, of course, the 40 beheaded babies from Gaza. And when I heard this story, I immediately remembered where have we heard this before, right? We had this in Kuwait, where this where the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, I think, I believe, testified with crocodile tears that the Iraqi
Yeah.
soldier took the babies out of the incubator, smashed them on the ground, etc., etc.
The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying.
Not even that is new, because in the First World War I found old leaflets where they already said that Germans are bayoneting babies, one after the other. So it's a very common and psychologically effective way of dehumanizing. This is what you said at the very beginning, the counterpart. And if I may, I believe it was Professor Omar Batov who told me there's a linear transgression to genocide. He said the first step is dehumanization, which we're seeing in Gaza. The second step is ethnic cleansing, which we're seeing in Gaza. And then he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, and if you can't get them out, you kill them. So he was very concerned that this is the
Yeah.
trajectory that we are on and might see in Gaza. But that was the keyword, because you said it
Well,
before, dehumanization.
yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, it's perfectly clear that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to eliminate everybody, and that's why they're deliberately targeting journalists, deliberately targeting health workers, and deliberately targeting children with their snipers. And why they have this. They award prizes internally, the IDF snipers, if they can have a 2-for-1 shot, by which they mean kill an unborn child in its mother's womb. So this is perfectly plainly a genocide, an attempt to eradicate all Palestinians and those who they can't eradicate to push them out of Gaza, and indeed they will try the same with the West Bank. And that's what's happening. It's perfectly plain that that's what's happening. So you mentioned the 40 beheaded babies. Uh, I mean that's true, but of course that was a story which was invented, and but it's a story which is replicated in reality in Gaza almost every day. Children are being beheaded and cut in half and blown to smithereens and burnt alive, and we don't see anything in the way of the kind of propaganda we got about these non-existent 40 beheaded babies. Every Zionist accusation is a confession. They accused the Palestinian resistance of doing something when what is actually happening is that they are doing much worse themselves, and the Palestinian resistance is not doing what they have said that they are doing. There were no rapes, there was no beheaded babies. The 1,200 people who died, it's commonly agreed now, most of them were killed by the IDF themselves using the Hannibal Directive. I mean, all of the things that they say are lies, and that we should recognize that. So I want to suggest that this is not just something which is uh, what happens in war. You mentioned the example of the Germans and the Hun raping the Belgian nuns and all that stuff. I mean, that yes, of course, that's what happens in those kinds of wars. But what we see with in Israel is a special kind of cruelty and brutality, which actually far exceeds even what they accuse the Palestinian resistance of, and that's quite dramatic. I don't know we've seen that level of, I mean, targeting of children, shooting of children in the head, sniping children in the head. That Russians don't do that in Ukraine. The Americans didn't even do that in Vietnam. I mean, they did some horrible and brutal things, but what we're seeing in Israel now is far and away worse than we've seen for half a century at least.
Hmm. I interviewed the US surgeon Mark Perlmutter. He was actually in Gaza in a hospital at the very moment it was bombed, but he describes exactly what you said. There is intentional kill shots for children, etc.
Yeah.
Coming back to the 40 babies, for me that's interesting because I mean under the umbrella of propaganda, because President Biden has regurgitated this, what we now know was absolutely untrue. And today you have many people who believe the story. Still
Yeah.
today, despite it being debunked more or less, some hesitant debunking has even taken place in the so-called mainstream media. But most people that you talk today about this still believe it. So how can, for you, from a research perspective, what's the best countermeasure to counter such a now ingrained, almost stereotype already?
Well, I mean, I think that we face a battle on many fronts. So, although public opinion has become more and more critical of Israel, it's also the case that you find this with other examples and other work I've done in previous conflicts. It's also the case that people who don't have access to other information or maybe slightly predisposed to believe can often believe elements of the propaganda which will make them more sympathetic towards the Zionists. But at the same time, uh, it's quite possible that they will have an underlying skepticism, and that I think that's what you find as people become more and more skeptical. It's still the case that sometimes propaganda narratives can sway them, or they might believe particular things have happened or not happened. But at the same time, we're seeing a general move away, and now it's the case that a majority of people in the UK, for example, young people in the UK, believe that Israel shouldn't exist, that it should be dismantled. And that's a tremendous change from 18 months ago. So we're seeing, of course, this battle. And of course, the reason that they continue with this 40 beheaded babies claim, and they continue with the rapes claim, and they continue with all the claims that have been debunked, is because they know that they have access to the mainstream which is much superior to all of those who are their critics, and that will therefore help them.
From your perspective, in the current, let's just in our area, in our time period, what's the most dangerous form of propaganda? I mean, it's difficult because it's omnipresent. It's everywhere. You know, people don't really realize it was. I mean, Top Gun, for example, was a
Hmm.
state-of-the-art propaganda movie. That was when you and me were young, right?
Sure.
Um, but
Well,
it's everywhere.
I think that the interesting thing is that you can see that there are appalling atrocities that the Zionists are, bombing tents and incinerating people. But there's a sort of unwillingness to treat that as being on a par with what the Zionists claim the Palestinians have done to them. And I think that underlying that is a kind of unconscious racism that people don't really think of Palestinian lives as being as worthy as Jewish lives, and that's a curious thing because it's not. I don't think. I think it's specifically Jewish lives as opposed to white lives. That's a curious thing, and it's an indication of how far the sort of propaganda about the persecution of Jews in society or in history even has gone, such that we even unconsciously tend to elevate Jewish safety over the safety of others, including of white people. And I think that's really interesting and not well understood. Because, of course, it's the case that in Western societies, Jews are advantaged or privileged in every metric that you look at. But people don't recognize that. They don't understand that. And they think that if you say that, that somehow is itself anti-Jewish. And there's a real job of education to be done, I think, in relation to that. That actually, Palestinian lives are human lives, and we ought to be considering them on the same basis as we do with the lives of others.
That's an argument for anyone outside of Israel, but within Israel, it's very difficult. They're virtually indoctrinated right after kindergarten.
Sure,
Yeah.
which is why I would say that that the Zionist colony has to be dismantled. I mean, there can't be a Jewish state in the Levant because it inevitably will be genocidal. And if we want to stop genocide, which all sane human beings do, then we need to dismantle the Zionist entity and have a Palestinian state. And what do we say to the Palestinians after the people who've tried to genocide them are still there in Palestine? Well, I mean that's an uncomfortable discussion to have, but really we can't expect Palestinians to live with people who have done and want to continue to genocide them. So there's a real argument here about what happens to the Zionist movement. How do we dismantle the Zionist movement, the colony in Palestine, and the Zionist movement more broadly, such that they are not a threat to either the Palestinians or to Muslims more generally, or indeed to Western democracy.
At the moment, it goes the other way. So Israel is on the path of the Greater Israel, which they already have on their military uniform, the map of Greater Israel, Lebanon, Syria, etc., etc. So they're expanding.
Well, look, they want to do that. They want to create a greater Israel, which would have, which would annex most or all of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, a little bit of Turkey, most of Iraq, half of Egypt. But that's just that's the basics of a greater Israel. But let's remember that also that they are intervening across the region and outside the region. For example, in Somalia, in Sudan, across North Africa. When the UAE is currently under investigation for genocide in Somalia, and of course the UAE is effectively a pawn of the Zionist entity. So we have a much bigger project here than perhaps people have realized. I think people didn't even realize that Greater Israel was a real thing, but actually they want to go much further than that, and that's a really shocking element of this that people I think really need to start to pay attention to.
Mm. Just a thought comes in my mind. Are you aware of Qatar Gate? It's a scandal, Qatar. It's a Qatar Gate scandal, so to speak, where Qatari money was flowing directly into Netanyahu's cabinet.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Well, I mean
Uh,
that's right. I mean that I mean Qatar is represented as being a critic of Israel, and it's said that it hosts Hamas and all that stuff. Well, of course it hosted Hamas because it was asked to by the US. So yes, of course, Qatar is implicated deeply, as are the Saudis, as is the UAE, as is Turkey. Indeed, even South Africa is implicated in supporting what's happening. Even although South Africa is taking the ICJ case, there are industries in South Africa connected to the ANC which are actually profiting by supplying coal. For example, one of the biggest suppliers of coal to the entity is
exactly,
South Africans.
exactly. I did a piece on this one, and there are, let's just say, quite some interesting comments as a reaction on that, because there is this contradiction where, as you said, South Africa put
Yeah,
Israel in front of the ICG, and at the same time, they're
yeah,
basically funding the war machine by virtually providing the energy Israel needs to continue this war.
that's right.
It's just really paradox. David, you were really generous with your time. But before we conclude, is there in regards to manipulation and propaganda, is there one specific topic that is especially close to your heart?
Well, I mean, I've been doing work on propaganda for decades now, but in the recent past, I've done stuff on Ukraine recently, but mainly focused on Zionism. And I suppose that the observation which strikes me most about that is that when I started to do this work, I had no idea that I was studying Zionism. I was looking at Islamophobia, neoconservatism. And it was only by doing that work that I sort of realized that I was studying Zionism. And then when I started to study Zionism, I didn't really have any idea about the extent of the topic that I was studying. And I remember being denounced by this left-wing Jewish organization called Judas, who said that Zionism was the IDF and the Israeli government in reality, and that in my head it was all these mad things like interfaith work or chicken soup or Zionist front groups, etc. And so what I did in response to that was to count up all the formerly Zionist organizations in the UK, and there was 221 of them or something, and then all of the surrounding Zionist organizations, the charities, the lobby groups, etc. About 3,000, I think, in the UK. And when you start to have that kind of volume or of an area to study, you suddenly realize this is a much bigger area of study than you had realized. And I'm only talking about the UK, never mind the perhaps 10,000 organizations in the US and thousands more around the world. And an area of study which I really hadn't appreciated was as big as it actually is. And I think that there's a need for more people to do this kind of work because there's a lot more to do.
So if people want to educate themselves about that specific topic, what literature would you recommend, maybe for myself?
Well, I mean, we have the website Powerbase where we log and record individuals and organizations engaged in managing and lobbying and power relations. So people can look at Powerbase. I mean, I have a Substack as well, and obviously I'm on X and Instagram as well. But I would also say to people to get together and to do your own research and to collaborate and to find where are the Zionist organizations in your own town or your own locality, and how could you most effectively challenge them. Everyone can do that. It's not difficult to find these organizations. It just requires elementary research skills. So I think there's a need to generalize that idea that you do research to find out where the supporters of genocide are. Sure.
David, Professor David Miller. It was my pleasure talking to you again. I want to highlight this book because I just read it. Was my pleasure talking to you, and I wish you all the best. And I will follow your progress, especially the progress of your landmark court case in November, with interest.
Thank you.
If you made it that far, congratulations! You are ahead of the pack. If this video resonated with you in any kind of form, don't just scroll away. Hit like, drop a comment, share it with someone who really needs to see it, and most importantly, subscribe. It sounds like a small thing, and honestly, it probably is a small thing, but this is exactly how we can keep these conversations alive. And if you missed it at the beginning, my Twitter account has been permanently suspended. Not for spam, not for bots, but for being too critical, for questioning the wrong people and interests. And that's the game now. Step too far out of the lines and they erase you. So if you value independent voices, if you want to stay connected, Substack is the place to go. It's free, the link's right below, and I would really love to hear from you. Tell me how it's changing the way you see the world and its people. So thanks for watching, thanks for thinking, and remember, always look beyond the headlines.